Airplanes. It's the way we get around, transport goods, and fight for our country. Flight has puzzled man for all of history. Even though we figured out how to fly, we still innovate aircraft. But before I get into planes today, I'll go over the history and innovations that led up to the aircraft we know today. Perhaps the most historic flight in history was the famous Wright brothers' flight, but the brothers weren't the first to fly. The first known form of flight was a kite, invented in China over 3,000 years ago. Then about 2,800 years later, in 1804, a man by the name of Sir George Cayley created the world's first glider. Using the concept of the airfoil, he was perhaps the first to fly. Then came the world's first controlled glider, invented by Otto Nathaniel, aka the Glider King. He flew over 2,000 times in his lifetime until a tragic accident in 1896 that killed him. Finally, we reached the Wright brothers. Being only bicycle owners in Dayton, Ohio, they didn't have much funding for their prototypes. Thus, they moved to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, to use the strong winds there. Finally, on December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers conducted 4 flights. Their first flight lasted only 12 seconds, and their last lasted 59 seconds, traveling 852 feet. And as soon as the word got out, the U.S. already wanted them to build a military aircraft. And in 1909, the Wright brothers accepted. In 1912, planes are already used for deadly uses, as machine guns are attached to planes, and bombs are dropped onto cities in the Balkan War. 2 years later, in 1914, World War I begins, and planes are amazingly improved. And when the war ends in 1918, over 36,000 planes are destroyed. In 1919, the world's first passenger flight was made, carrying 11 people, also forming the first airline, Trucks International Airline. In 1929, 10 years later, plane safety becomes a big issue. The highest death rate for aircraft in U.S. history. Thus, we get to the innovations of aircraft. First of all, I'll talk about aircraft safety improvements that decreased that death rate. The first issue is lightning. Now, airplanes are made with as much non-conducting material as possible. Issue 2, ice and snow. Routed heating used to prevent ice buildup to the wings and tail that prevents them from working. Third, engine failure. Sadly, there is not much that can be done to prevent this, but emergency landing sites have been placed around the world for this. Fourth, stalling. Voice warning systems help prevent stalls. Fifth, fires. Fire bottles, close to fire extinguishers, can be used to battle fires in flight. And finally, bird strikes. Recorded sounds of predators to scare away birds, as well as letting grass around the airport to grow long to make it harder for birds to land around the area. Now, we move on to military planes. Almost all military planes are jet fighters. So, how does the jet work? Well, the jet is made up of 4 parts: compression chamber, combustion, turbine, and exhaust. The compression chamber sucks in air from the outside and, well, compresses it. Then, in the combustion chamber, fuel ignites the compressed air and is shot at the turbine at half the speed of sound. The air then turns the turbine, which also powers the compression chamber. Here, the air also loses some of its speed. And finally, the exhaust shoots the air out at a higher speed than what to begin with, creating thrust for the plane. Jet fighters in the 1930s were unreliable, as fuel shortages, pilot losses, and technical difficulties were all too frequent. By the 1950s, most of these problems were resolved, and the main focus now was aerodynamics and aerospace building materials. During this time, the sound barrier can be broken in a plane with the afterburn of jets. And finally, in the 1980s, not much changes as technologies from the 1950s are still being innovated, as also maneuverability and weapons are being improved. Next, there's commercial airlines. At first, in the 1930s, this form of travel was not a very pleasant experience. 17 people in a plane at the maximum. There is no air conditioning and little heating, and the smell of hot metal and oil to brighten the mood. As even more, there are only leather seats and disinfectant to clean up after airsick passengers. By the time the 1950s came, air travel became much better, as new planes offered speed and comfort, although only for short distances. Most airlines only carried out short distances. Also, these new planes could carry 470 passengers in a single flight instead of 17. Then, the 1980s came, as airlines offer much longer distances as technology improved. Also, airlines could hold 500 people in a plane now. Airplanes have come a long way since just 100 years ago. Now, instead of the measly 200, 300 mile per hour planes in the 1930s, military planes can travel up to 7,000 miles per hour. Commercial airlines can travel across the country and more in less time than ever. So, whether it's traveling or fighting for your country, airplanes are the cutting edge of travel that still puzzle most people, that still get us on our way.
It is